And Ross Jackson right now of Locked On Saints also writes for us right here at LouisianaSports.net. Ross, how are you this morning?
Hey, buddy, I'm doing great. Doing great. Thanks for your patience. Hope you're doing well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the time. Look, man, we have had internet issues for like 2 days. Like yesterday, during the middle of the show, we completely lost internet. The weather's been awful.
Oh.
Like I totally get it. That is not on you. Look, Ross, OTAs are underway for the New Orleans Saints. Gonna go just start super broad here. You can take this whichever direction you want. Maybe just your biggest overall takeaways from being out there at OTAs.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we're, of course, watching is the quarterback competition, right? And so I think as we're watching that, no decisions are going to be made during OTAs, but you get the opportunity to start to kind of see where the starting place is and what the growth looks like after that. And so we saw, Spencer Rattler off to a fast start, which makes sense, has more NFL experience. Technically, on a per-play basis, also has more collegiate experience than Tyler Shuck, more than 600 more snaps than Tyler Shuck in college, more than 300 additional passing attempts as opposed to Tyler Shuck, or as compared to Tyler Shuck in college. So you saw sort of the experience of the operation, getting in and out of the huddle, being able to run the offense, commanding the offense, making quick and precise decisions as well. I think all of that sort of stood out. I think that the other two kind of big takeaways would have been, taking a look at where things were with the offensive line, seeing Trevor Penning moved to the inside, giving them Calvin Banks and Taliesin flung over on the outside at tackle, and then, looking over at this kind of new defensive scheme and where things are. But one last thing I'll mention was just kind of the vibes, right? Like some part of this too is not just about what happens on the field. It's, what's the kind of mood in the clubhouse? How's everybody feeling after a 5-win season and all these other things? And I would say that like the vibe of practice, the vibe of the building, the vibe of the locker room was very, very different. One player telling me that they feel that they're headed, taking steps in the right direction with this new coaching staff. So you can kind of feel a little bit of the promise and optimism that should be there at this point in the year.
Ross, obviously there are players out there that'll stand out, but as far as like maybe any negatives, was there something you like thought was going to look a little bit better than it has?
I don't think so. I think that is one of those things that maybe comes together a little bit more in training camp. During this time, what you're really seeing is like 7-on-7s at best, and then you're seeing, individual drills based on the position, maybe some walkthrough or run game install and things like that. So there's not really a lot of the opportunity to kind of put anything under so much of a microscope that you go to the critical side of it. I will say that like the Saints having 5 players that, aren't available because of injury right now, maybe could give people a little bit of pause, but it's worth remembering that like 2 of those players, Taysom Hill and Foster Moreau, they're coming off of injuries from last year. Quincy Riley's dealing with an injury right now that was a post-draft procedure, but something that pre-existed his selection. And really the only, and Dallin Holker's dealing with something that happened earlier in the offseason as well, or earlier, away from the team, or not away from the team, but, early in the offseason. And then you have Jake Haener, who was injured in practice, dealing with that oblique injury, and he's probably going to be out for OTAs. But nothing super severe. And the majority of the things that they're dealing with are things that pre-exist, OTAs. And so I think that even that has a little bit of context that even if you start to feel a little bit concerned about it, has some context that maybe makes you feel a little bit better.
Ross, earlier you were talking about you kept an eye on Trevor Penning. Obviously, his move to guard is something that a lot of people have talked about. With him moving to guard, that O-line, you got Fuaga Banks, you got Penning, Ruiz, Eric McCoy. How good could this O-line potentially be under this Kellen Moore scheme? Like, could this be a strength for the team in 2025?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up Kellen Moore in that, because I was going to say I think that offensive line can go as far as the coaching will take it. I think that that's the big thing about this. If Trevor Penning pans out at left guard, you've got 4 first-round picks and a first-round grade guy in Eric McCoy, who just happened to fall into the Saints' lap in the second round during his draft year. But as a part of that, and sort of figuring out where this team can head next, it's really going to be about how the scheme complements the players and how the coaching complements the players. And I would have high hopes for that, looking into where this is headed, because I like the approach that the coaching staff is taking. I had a great conversation with TJ Paganetti, who's the Saints run game coordinator, kind of a new position for the team. And he spoke a lot about, to put it frankly, one of my favorite things that he said was, we don't put players in positions that suck. And I think that's just as important a part of the equation as the individual players are, is don't put them in bad situations and don't put them in positions where you're asking them to do something that maybe they struggle in that technique, or maybe they're not as successful there, or they could be doing it a slightly different way, but you really want them to do it this way, not getting married to those things. So I think that the lack of ego amongst the coaching staff in that way will allow them to be able to better adjust things to complement what it is that offensive line, whatever configuration it takes, but in particular, if that's the configuration, just finding ways to better complement what it is that configuration of offensive linemen can do, it would be massive. And so that, I think, is the other big piece to this as well, is, what is the coaching staff going to ask them to do, and how well do they coach it up? How do they coach it up? And then that's really going to be the thing that raises or drops the ceiling on what it is that these players are going to be able to do, regardless of the offensive line configuration.
Ross Jackson joining us right now. Ross, yesterday on LouisianaSports.net, you put up a little piece on Clyde EdwardsHelaire talking about, his chances of making the team. Kind of broke down the running back depth chart as well behind Alvin Kamara. What are your thoughts on Clyde? Like, could he be a weapon in this offense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's one of those guys that has like the versatility to kind of be able to do everything. He can run between the tackles, he can get outside the tackles, he can catch passes, and he's a solid pass protector. If nothing else, he's a willing pass protector. It's going to be challenging for him just based on the fact that there are so many running backs in that room right now, and so it's an uphill climb no matter where you're starting in this situation. But I think that those elements of his game, and then in addition to that, the veteran experience that he brings, he's the second most experienced running back going into his sixth season behind Alvin Kamara. I think that those things all kind of complement what it is that he should be able to bring, or not necessarily complement, but kind of elevate what it is that he brings to this team. And so I don't know if he makes it on the active roster. I don't know if he makes it on the practice squad, but I do give him a pretty fair shot at being one of the 53 plus guys to end up making the roster. The big question is going to be how many running backs they keep on the active roster, because right now they don't have a fullback rostered. So do they utilize that position or that piece somewhere else, that spot, or do they intend to utilize that as a point of keeping a fourth running back? It's going to be interesting to see how they utilize that, even if that player is inactive on some games. But I do think that he has a chance if there's 4 running backs kept, or if there's 3 running backs plus additional on the practice squad, he's got a chance to make a swing at one of those spots.
Sticking with the running back room, I mean, you mentioned the crowded room, right? You have Kamara, EdwardsHelaire. You brought in Devin Neal and Marcus Yarns, the rookies. What does the future of Kendra Miller look like in New Orleans?
Yeah, I mean, it's an uphill climb for him too, right? That's one of those big things where, he was drafted by a different coaching staff. He's had injury issues that have kind of kept him off of the field, and it's all been kind of different injuries, different things and everything. So he's got an uphill climb, but he also has a blank slate, which I think is helpful. You add Bayless Jones Jr. to that room as well as another veteran guy, ex-Valaday, who was with the team last year. Like, there's a lot of these guys in this room. And so nobody is really walking in to a roster spot in this room except for Alvin Kamara. And then maybe you can make the argument for Devin Neal since he was drafted by this coaching staff. I also think Devin Neal is going to be a good NFL player, so I would give him that roster spot for that reason. But Kendra is going to have an opportunity here to prove that kind of the perception that's been built around him under that previous coaching staff, a team that was dealing with injury all over the place, everything like that, isn't really a perception of him. It was sort of a perception of his circumstance or his situation. He's got a real chance to kind of change the course of that conversation here this offseason.
Ross, switching to the defense here a little bit. You were talking about, looking at the scheme under Brandon Staley, but big topic of conversation has been the Saints secondary, because there are some pieces you have to replace there. What's that group kind of looked like?
Yeah, I think on the defensive side or defensive secondary with the corners, I think is kind of where the biggest question mark is right now. I think your safeties are going to be set in Tyrann Mathieu and Justin Reed. The question will become, who's that rotational safety that maybe comes in for dime sets and things like that? Does that remain Jordan Howden, or does a guy like Jonas Sanker, who was a part of this year's draft class, end up stepping into that role? So it'll be a little bit of a battle there, I think you'll find. But when it comes to corner, right, you're having to replace Marshawn Lattimore, who was traded away last year. You're having to replace Paul Senadebo, who signed with the New York Jets this offseason. So you've got Kool-Aid McKinstry as a guy that I think is, a lock in one of your outside spots. And then Alontae Taylor is going to have a role. Maybe that's outside in base packages, and then he moves inside at nickel. We'll kind of see how it is that Brandon Staley decides to use him. But I think keeping him maximized would be keeping him in the slot in some way, where he's allowed to be a disruptor as a pass rusher, as a run defender, in coverage, threatening at the line of scrimmage, playing near the line of scrimmage, all these other things. So I think you want to find a way to do that. So then that opens up sort of that outside corner spot at least in nickel packages. And so right now, that's Isaac Adams' spot. He's the guy that came back. He had a great 2023 with the team, where the team was having to circumvent injuries at the position, and he played really well there. Went off, spent a year in San Francisco with the 49ers, where Brandon Staley, now New Orleans Saints defensive coordinator, was the assistant head coach. And so those two got some opportunity with one another. So now they bring that back here to New Orleans. But now you've got Quincy Riley, who you've also drafted out of Louisville, who I think is a really talented player and is going to be a starter at some point. I just don't know if it's going to be week one. He's one of the guys that's managing injury right now, or managing rehab right now. And so we'll see when he gets back, but that's going to kind of be the battle for that other spot, I believe. And so we'll see where Quincy Riley ends up kind of contributing. And then the other name to watch isn't on the roster yet, but could be on the roster, and that's Asante Samuel Jr. Brandon Staley and Asante Samuel Jr. go back to the Chargers days. Asante was part of Brandon Staley's first ever draft class as a head coach. He's on the free agent market. He had a neck procedure earlier this offseason, set to be checked in July. If he's cleared from that, I expect that the Saints, who have already had him in for a visit, would at least show some interest there. So you could see another player that gets added to that sort of jumble and to that battle for the Saints in their secondary.
Ross, before we get you out of here, as far as like what fans should keep an eye on, obviously taking Kelvin Banks out of the equation, who appears to be a day one starter, like, are there any rookies out there to keep an eye on that you think these guys could play early?
Yeah, Danny Stutzman's just so much fun to watch all the time, man. The Oklahoma linebacker, he is just a ball of energy, brings a lot of energy to a team, all these other things. On a show that we did recently, former New Orleans Saints wide receiver Lance Moore mentioned that, like, there's no year requirement for leadership. You just kind of have to have the time on task for sure, but you've also just have to have the personality that people are willing to rally around. And his personality is a personality that people are willing to rally around. And so I'd definitely be watching out for him. And a guy that I think is going a little bit under discussed right now is defensive tackle Vernon Broughton. Him coming in, I think people were kind of surprised because there were other defensive tackles on the board and everything, but there's a connection here between Broughton and Bo Davis, Saints defensive line coach. They work together over in Texas. He's kind of getting the treatment of, an early rotational player that's playing at nose tackle, moving outside to 3-4 defensive end. He's kind of getting a lot of these different opportunities. So he'd be another one, number 91, that I'd be watching as well, just to kind of see if he ends up turning into one of the surprise contributors for a lot of people out of this draft class, because he's at this sort of unsexy position and is a name that people aren't really talking about very much.
Ross Jackson, you can catch his stuff at Locked On Saints, as well as see his articles right here at LouisianaSports.net. Ross, thanks so much for the time this morning.
Thank you, man. You take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you here soon. Appreciate you having me.